Hi YouTubers, today I'm going to talk about the JARDINI, known by many names. It's also called the pearl Arowana, northern Saratoga to name a few, but you can simply call it the jar. This one I've got is named Sam. I had him for about 13 years now and counting. And I'm going to show you how you can keep one in the house yourself and take care of it. Okay, tank size. Keeping a jar in a tank needs proper investment, so it's best to go as big as possible. So how big do you say? Well, let's put it in perspective. True experts believe that it should be somewhere around about at least 2 meters by 1 meter by 75 centimeters in terms of depth. It's quite huge for a normal house. Most people won't have the space for it. But what I've got is actually only 6 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet in depth. Quite smaller obviously, but it has worked for my jar. I kept this one for 13 years. Bear in mind, I do want him to be upgraded to a larger tank. Having said that, you should always try to get the largest tank possible in the outset, so you don't have to transfer the fish to a new home. And to top it all off, getting new tanks can prove more expensive in the long run as well. So filtration. So what's the best filtration for a JARDINI tank? Well, to start off, there are many options like hobs, sumps and canisters. The better ones to go for would be the sumps or the canisters. In my case, in my 6 by 2 by 2 feet tank, I've got a double canister filter. Combined output around about 4,000 litres an hour. That's probably much of the ballpark where you want it at. The beauty about double canisters is that if one conks out, you still got one as a backup, so to replace it. The other requirement I find is that you need lots of biological filtration, and you can get that from ceramic media and so forth. And why is that? Because the reason is that nitrogen in the form of ammonia and nitrite are bad for any fish. They're like jars. Biological filtration will help harbor good bacteria, so it converts them ultimately to nitrate, which is less toxic. With nitrate, you just simply change water to get rid of it. So biological media is a must for any tank, so you must have it, heaps of it. The other media we'll probably put in is cotton wool, just to clean up the mechanical side of the filtration. So what about other types of filtration? Chemical and UV sterilizers and carbon maybe? Well, I find that it's not really needed, only because you're going to change your water on a regular basis. And what I mean change is from 2 weeks to 1 month, depending on how often you feed it. And it becomes inconsequential to have such things in your tank. The water's going to clear up anyway. So yeah, no fancy chemical media or UV sterilizers basically. Water chemistry. To get a gauge of what type of water we should put in a tank for a jar, we need to know where it comes from. But basically, being a tropical North Australian fish and Papua New Guinea, the waters there are actually slightly acidic to neutral, with temperatures in the cooler dry ranging from 15 degrees to the summer months of about 30, 32, 33 degrees at daytime. So that's actually a variable temperature, and you should know by now that nothing's ever thick. We can gauge that we can keep the jar around about 25 degrees in our tank, and we can just top it up with neutral water basically. I mean, it's a naturally hardy fish and it's not prone to much problems, so keeping around medium parameters is probably the best way to go. There is one thing I would suggest, and that's not to put any salt. Well, the thing is, like, there's a couple of scenarios where you're probably likely to consider putting salt into a jar tank. First of all, you might have a community tank and with semi-brackish fish like catfish, archerfish, stingrays for example, which can tolerate salt. The other thing is your fish might have got sick with some buoyancy problems or whatever, and you're trying to fix the issue with a salt bath. Well, salt is probably not the best way to alleviate those problems, especially in a community tank or with a sick fish, and I'm going to tell you why. And the reason why salt is not good for a jar is because it's a prehistoric fish which lived in truly freshwater environment for millions and millions of years. Being a freshwater fish, like all freshwater fish, they need salt in their body more so than the outside environment. So they're actually constantly trying to take in salt from the water, from the food sources and so forth. So their body's actually adapted to absorb as much salt as possible because of the lack of salt in the fresh water. What you do when you put in salt into the water is you're actually overdosing fish, because it can't excrete the salt fast enough, then it can take in. To give you an example, like if you prolong salt use, what will happen is it will first initially lose its color. Secondly, it will then start to lose its appetite, and eventually, if enough salt is placed in, it will eventually die. So probably no salt at all, no matter what the circumstances. In terms of decor, in my tank I've got gravel at the bottom, and you can get away with bare bottom tanks. A lot of Asian Arowanas, the Formosus, have bare bottom tanks, and that's fine. I also got Java fern, and Java fern is good because basically if the fish swims past, it just brushes it off, and it's quite nice and soft, so it doesn't hurt fish at all. It probably can get dislodged, but that's fine for me. I'll just replant it. Java fern's actually quite hardy as well and low maintenance. In terms of hard decor, I would avoid rocks and any bogwood, and especially anything with hard and jagged surfaces and that are pointy as well. Hard decor limits the movement, especially in a 6x2 tank. You hardly got any, there's less space for especially a jar my size, so you don't want anything that can limit its space. And the other thing is, if the fish gets spooked for any reason and starts to jump or swim amok, it can potentially hurt itself, especially with the hard and rough and sharp edges on any hard decor. You can get away with, in a larger tanks, like say the 2 meter by 1 meter tanks, you can put hard decor in like rocks and bogwood, but then I would limit it to round things and things that are of smooth surfaces, like big large round stones, for instance. I wouldn't put anything that again is actually hard, is sharp or pointy, just in case it does try to injure itself. You got to remember that it's got a long serpentine body, and it's designed for one thing, and that's like a high-speed chases. It's never been designed to move around things. So yeah, I would avoid rocks and bogwood that has hard pointy edges. Growth rate and feeding. Growth rate and feeding go hand in hand. Depending on the size of the jar, you're either going to feed it every day or every other day. Okay, so assuming you've got a 10 centimeter jar you just bought, fingerling. So if it starts out at that size, you can feed them every day, and high protein foods will be ideal. Probably what they want, like little insects and bloodworms and shrimp. As long as it's high protein and it readily accepts it, that's fine. So every day, and what you find out is within 1 year, you'll probably reach a foot quite quickly, and you'll be all happy and surprised that you're rearing your jar to such a fast pace. But generally after 30 centimeters, its growth rate slows down, and this is where the size of the tank comes in. If you've got a larger size, I've got a feeling that you might get a larger jar depending on the size of the tank. So after 30 centimeters, what happens is, to obtain the next 15 centimeters to get up to 45, for instance, it takes around about at least 3 to 4 years of feeding to get to that size. So it slows down in length, and during that time, when you feed it, I'll probably feed it every day, skipping a day here and there. So out of, like, say 7 days in a 7-day week, I'll probably miss like 2 days. So it's slightly reduced feeding, but nevertheless it's still growing. Okay, once it gets to about 45 to 50 centimeters, it starts to drastically slow down even more in terms of its length, to a point where actually you hardly notice its growth at all. And what's happening is actually it's growing sideways, or its girth. And if you look at behind its head, around its neck or shoulders, or whatever you want to call it, find out it will get thicker there instead of growing longer. It's during this time that I would skip feeding every day, and I'll feed it every other day. So if I did a Monday feed, I'll skip Tuesday and do a Wednesday, and so forth, something like that. You'll also notice that this is the point where, like, this is its magnificence. It's how well you raise your jar, the color and everything should come out by this time. The other thing I should mention about feeding is that the jar lives in 2 distinct seasons in the Northern Territory. There's a cooler, dry season, which at nights can get up to about 15 degrees, even slightly lower, to during the day, which can be from 25 to 30 depending on the day, and that's actually quite cool. Whereas in the wet season, it can range from 15 plus at night to 30 plus. So it's actually quite a variable temperature. And what happens is, in the dry, the cooler dry, it probably will eat less, especially at night, and during the day you will try to scavenge for food, whatever. But during the wet season, that's when most of the foods come out, and all the frogs and insects and birds start to mate and everything. So that's when it's going to get most of its food. So it will be binge eating during the wet, and you can pretty much replicate that in your tank, especially if you're in a temperate environment like what I am in Sydney. In winter, we're going to get a cold winter, so what we do there is actually we reduce the feeding to a point where we can even feed it every third day, even depending on the temperature. And as it gets warmer during the summer months, you can actually increase its feeding to every day. So it is pretty much a variable feeding regime for the jar. Diet. So natural diet of jars includes frogs, fish, insects, invertebrate, and even some plant matter. And that, you heard right, it can eat veggies. I have mine on food sticks, crickets, brine shrimp, fresh peeled prawns, and even my own personal recipe which I uploaded a while back on YouTube. You can check out the recipe on my jar on this link, but basically it's a combination of fish fillets, prawns, baby spinach, carrots, or sweet potato, or you can have both. I feed it frozen and unthawed. There seems to be no long-term effects of being fed frozen, so I don't thaw the food, I actually just throw it in frozen. What about live fish? Well, I don't recommend live fish being fed to it. Not only it's morally cruel for the fish concerned, but the added worry of bringing potential virus, bacteria and disease is pretty much not worth it. And I don't feed frogs either, even though it is a natural diet of jars. Nowadays, I also stay away from proprietary food sticks. I find that there are too many artificial additives and colouring and preservatives or whatever enhancing things that goes into these food sticks. However, that's your call if you do decide to use it. Good luck to you, because I have tried, but I don't find it any good. So that's about it. There is one final thing I would like to say, and that's how to distinguish a jar between Asian Arowana, the Formosus, and red spotted Arowana, or Leichardti, the JARDINI'S southern brother. So to tell an Asian Arowana, the Formosus, from a JARDINI, it's quite simple. You just count the row of scales. The Asian Arowana has 5 distinct rows of scales, whereas both the JARDINI and the Leichardti will have 7, and you can use that rule every single time and it works, because the Formosus generally has larger scales, being a slightly smaller fish. Distinguish between a JARDINI and a Leichardti, you have to do a couple of things. First, you got to look at its head, its profile of its head. The JARDINI will have a curved, like a scalloped profile, with its head looking a bit smaller than the Leichardti, and it scallops from its neck down towards its mouth. In the smallest fry, you'll find that its eye protrudes a bit above the head, because it scallops down a bit, whereas the Leichardti won't have that. The other thing you will notice is the amount of spot on the Leichardti. It will have little red spots all along its body, whereas when you look at the JARDINI, it will have little orange to red or pinkish crescents on all along its scales, giving it a bit more colour to its overall body. And having said that, Leichardti will pretty much have a general silver palette to it, whereas the JARDINI'S will have a general more bronze-like palette to it, giving it almost like a gold-like appearance in some instances. The other thing you will notice about the JARDINI is along its gill plate you will have some markings working from its eyes to the back of its gills. It's like almost like war paint. Whereas if you look at the Leichardti, it's rather plain and silver. So if you look at those traits, you can distinguish between the Leichardti and the JARDINI quite easily. Well, thanks for listening, guys. I think that's it. Check the link on my recipe for the jar if you're interested in making your own food for the fish. Otherwise, just subscribe. Thanks a lot, guys.